sit there and there's a river or an ocean between me, which is the dunya, right? So I use it to get to my ultimate destination, which is we're all going to die and we're going to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we want permanent Jannah. But in this world, we're going to use whatever Allah gives us and whatever tools and whatever gifts Allah gives us. But if we get too much water in the ship, what happens? You drown. Then that's the fine line that we're trying to balance, right? Is that you use the dunya, but the dunya is not the objective. And when you get too immersed in it, then you sink. And you see this all around, right? You see people, and like you know people that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sometimes He gives so much that a person then gets so entangled in dunya. Like you probably had friends from college and this and that, they go on to do jobs, and all of a sudden, then you don't see them anymore, or they drift away. And this is very, very something that we want to be careful of. Now, all of that said, obtaining a halal rizq is a mandate. A halal rizq is an obligation. طلب كسب الحلال فريضة. That earning a halal rizq is an obligation بعد الفريضة, after other faridas. So for example, you have to earn, but it's Jum'ah time, at least for the brothers, right? You can't be like, well, I'm earning a Islamic halal rizq, I'm at my job, I'm not going to go to Jum'ah. We know this. I'm giving a very simple example, which is to say that earning a halal rizq is an obligation. In fact, there's a narration, right, where some people are sitting in the masjid and they're just making dua. They're just making dua for rizq, right? And one of the Sahaba, he sees him and he's very upset. Like, that's not the way the system of Allah works. It doesn't just start raining money, right? But rather, you have to go out and work. The sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that you have to go out and work, and that وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى وَأَنَّ سَعْيَهُ سَوْفَ يُرَى. This is like whatever deeds you do in this world, you'll see in the hereafter. But also, whatever work you do in this world, you'll see the result in this world as well. Like, generally, the rule is that you work and you get a result, unless you sort of invest in some crypto or something that takes off, right? But generally, you have to work for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you. And then, once you work, you have to realize that that rizq is still from Allah. So you're working, that's the means, but the rizq is from Allah. Allah says, وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِلَّا عَلَى اللَّهِ رِزْقُهَا. Every single thing in the world, Allah takes care of it. And we're taught to have tawakkul in Allah like the birds. So what do the birds do in the morning? They chirp, right? But what else? They go out and get the worm, right? They actually go out and they search for food. They actually do their part with full certainty that Allah is going to provide for them, but they don't stay in their nest. And it's a very beautiful analogy of how the believer is supposed to operate in this world. Like, you go do your part and you have tawakkul that Allah is going to take care of you. And sometimes you're going to give certain things up, even though they seem really attractive, and still have that in realization that Allah is going to take care of me. Like, this seems like a no-brainer from a financial perspective, but it's a riba-based thing. It's the job has too much, haram components to it, or the investment is one that is not acceptable, etc. So always remember these sort of governing principles as we work through some of the mechanics. So let's look at kind of some ideas or principles then of Islamic finance. Before we go into the specifics that you guys asked about, I think it's really important still to think about the higher level. So we live in a capitalist world. What does that mean? Like, what's the mantra of the average person or the corporation? What does capitalism teach? Maximize profits, right? Make more money. And don't worry about necessarily the means. If you can do it or you can get away with it, that's sort of the overarching theme of the global capitalist society that we live in today. But Islam is not that. Islam is not that. Islam is, as I said at the very beginning, it's obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also there's this sort of it's not socialism, but there's an idea of wealth distribution, right? That wealth should not be concentrated so heavily in the hands of a few people. And actually the Quran mentions this, حَتَّى لَا تَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. It's really interesting. The ayah talks about distributing the spoils of war. And it says that so that that wealth is not concentrated in just a few of your hands, right? And if you think about the way that, say, like, and I know this is a little bit academic, but if you think about the way that the housing market is moving. So for those of you that are thinking about buying houses and such, like what's happening today is that large corporations are buying more and more houses, right? The sort of American dream was that if 50 years ago, everybody owned a house. And now more and more people are having to rent because more and more houses are being bought up by large Wall Street corporations who will then make people rent forever, right? Banks and so on and so forth, right? And then that rent money will go back into this cycle, which will allow them to buy even more, and then people will be like kind of left out. And that's not an Islamic sort of conception of wealth at an individual level or at a societal level. That's number one. Then understand that if you break down Islamic financial ethics, you can look at it in three components. Number one is that your income must be halal. Your income must be halal. I'm going to break down each of these three components. So your income must be halal. Number two, the way that you invest or spend must also be halal or Sharia compliant. And then thirdly, we talked about this yesterday in the larger session, which is after death, everything you own has to be distributed according to Sharia. Like as young people, we're not really thinking about death and inheritance, but the reality is that's a very explicit part of the Quran. Actually, the most explicit thing in the entire Quran is the rules of inheritance. Very, very fascinating. That's what I do professionally, right? Is help people navigate the inheritance rules and how they integrate and intertwine with conventional instruments and trusts and all of that kind of stuff, right? So when we think about halal income, let's first start there. What does it mean to say your income must be halal? Like, what do you have to think about when you finish college and you're looking for your first job or second job or 10th job, whatever? What considerations do you need to think about to say this job, is it halal for me or not? What do you think? What industry you're in, right? So what industries would not be permissible? This might be simple, but let's still kind of flesh this out. Good, right? So you can't go get a job at Budweiser, right? Like, that's not going to be allowed. You can't go work in a casino, right? Some like very common sense, like they're called vice industries, right? You're not going to go work in vice industries, things that are haram for other people or haram for ourselves, right? Or, a weapons manufacturer, things like that. You're not, and there's some questions about what they do specifically, but you're not going to want to work at least in the weapons division, right? Some companies have a lot of divisions, right? But you want to make sure that the industry that you are working in is halal, okay? That's really, really important. Some things will be categorically impermissible, right? Like we gave examples of things that are haram. You don't want to be involved in them. You don't want to facilitate them. What else is something that is not considered a vice industry, but would be considered very problematic from an Islamic perspective? Banks, exactly, right? Banking, nobody's going to think a job in a bank is a problem in society. Like, nobody thinks that's a bad thing. But from an Islamic perspective, now, again, there's different components of banks, but so I'm not making generalizations. I'm just trying to get you to think, as you do an analysis, that a lot of the jobs that are in banks are facilitating riba, right? Something that is haram and something that is categorically impermissible in our religion, and I'm going to talk more about it in a little bit. But at least from an industry perspective, that's our first screen. Some of these screens are going to be relevant to your investment questions as well, right? Where can I invest my money? The first screen is the same. Is this company doing things that are halal or haram? right? That's the first screen. It's going to be both for your investment as well as can I work there, right? That's number one. Number two is how you invest or where you spend. So to take this example, like I can't work in a casino, right? Everybody agrees? We know that's haram. What if I work in a hospital, or I work as a lawyer, or I work in tech, or I work in some other industry that is whatever, and my income is halal? Am I then allowed to go gamble it away in a casino? No. Now, in America, the principle is your money. You do whatever you want, right? And it's beautiful that as Muslims, we have an instinctive response to say no. Like, yes, it's your money, but it's Allah who gave you that money. وَآتُوهُم مِّن مَّالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ, Allah says. Give them from the wealth that Allah gave you. And Allah entrusted you. So whatever money we have, whether it's a lot or a little, it still has rules. We can't go squander it in a way that is haram. So we couldn't go to the casino. We also can't invest it however we want. And this is one that's pretty hard and sometimes people don't remember. So now I'm going to still do high level, then we'll come to the 401k questions and all that. But the reality is, investing in a Sharia compliant manner is much harder. Because you look at the first screen, okay, which is this company doing things that are halal or haram? Well, even that first screen is pretty hard because so many big companies do so many things, some of which are halal, some of which are haram, right? Like, take any big company. Like, they're called the Magnificent Seven, right? Let's take a few of those big, like a company like Facebook. What do they do? Or Meta. What do? They do a lot of different things, some of which are good, some of which are not good, right? Take a company like Google, right? Same thing, Apple, all of these companies, they do some things that are good, some things that are bad. So, but there's certain companies that just do things that are bad. At least we're going to take those out of the equation, right? If their whole thing is haram and the majority of their wealth is haram, like their income, their principles are haram, we're going to be out. But then you have companies like, for example, an airline where their main function is what? Flying. But then they also serve some alcohol, or a hotel, or this or that, right? So now you're going to get more complicated. And the scholars say there are percentages of like what is permissible and not in terms of how haram are they, right? Now you can avoid that by doing things that are completely permissible altogether. Generally real estate, for instance, is one. But the problem is your employer doesn't usually allow you to do that. They give you a 401k, and they give you a few options, typically, of how you can invest it. So we'll come back to this, but I just want to frame that you want to make sure that the industry that you are either investing in or that you are working in is not haram. And then on the investment side, the second filter is one of riba. So what is riba? Let's make it a little bit more interactive. Somebody tell me what riba is. Yes. So it's translated to interest, but that doesn't really give you the answer, okay? Because there are certain things in finance that are called interest that might not be riba, and there are certain things that are not called interest, but they're still riba, okay? So loosely that riba means interest, yes, but it's not a perfect definition. Anybody want to elaborate on that? What you understand riba to be and what you try to avoid? So simply, it's money for money, right? When you put in some money and you get more back, or you have to give more without any risk associated with it. So if I say to you, I want to borrow $10. You say, sure, here's $10. You now owe me $12. That's a interest-based riba transaction. Okay? Actually, let me do that again. I say I want to buy this water bottle from you, and I don't have $10. It's a $10 water bottle. We're at a hotel, right? So I don't have $10. Can I borrow $10? You say, sure, here's $10. You owe me 12 back, okay? And then I give you the 10 and I have the water bottle. But now I owe you 12, correct? That's haram, okay? That's a riba-based transaction. But if you said to me, this water bottle is $10, you don't have $10, no problem. I will sell you this water bottle for $12. You can pay me $1, per hour or per month or per year or whatever, right? That's not riba. Do you understand the difference? In finance, they're both going to be called interest, okay? But this is an installment sale. He's selling me an asset, okay? I bought this water bottle for $10. But if I simply borrowed $10 without an asset that is being sold, then that's going to be haram. Because in the 10 for 12 transaction, there was only money being exchanged for money. But in the, you sold me this water bottle for 12 instead of 10, that's okay, that's a deferred installment sale. Okay, why am I bringing this example? It's because it's important to understand what is riba, right? It's borrowing money and having to pay back more money. Okay? There's hadith has a lot of different definitions of riba. But in our times, basically, right, where we are doing a lending transaction, a riba, we want to do everything we can to avoid debt transactions because they are based just cash for cash. So if you want to start a business and you can go out to the bank, you can go to Bank of America or Chase or Wells Fargo or any of these places and you can take out a loan, a conventional loan. They are doing what? They're giving you money and they're telling you you're going to pay us back a premium, which is going to be riba. Whether your business succeeds or fails, we don't care. We don't care. You owe us this money. Versus a partnership. Islam says you can make money. You can either lend it charitably, like it's just a loan. I give you 100, you owe me back 100. Or you could say, you know what, you need 100, I'm going to become your business partner. Okay? I'm going to give you $100, and if your company takes off, I'm going to be a 20% partner, and I'm going to get 20% of the profits. And if this company fails, then I lose my $100. So Islam says that in order to make money, you have to have risk. Okay? You can't simply just borrow money or you can't lend money to someone and demand more in return. And now somebody might say, well, what's the problem with that? Because you have money, I need money, and we just do a loan transaction with riba. It seems like it's not a big deal. But the reality is all of Islamic Sharia is based not on one individual transaction, but on societal transactions. When this principle becomes pervasive, then what happens? Then you have economic crashes, and you have, you guys might remember 2008 crash, right? Like everybody was young, but there was this big crash, and it was all based on what? Riba. It was all based on a entire financial market where riba was running everything. And so people were borrowing, and then those banks would then sell those mortgages to other banks and so on and so forth. It was really complicated. But the idea was that interest system collapsed. And that will periodically happen. When there's enough lending and enough debt, then eventually the system collapses and it starts over. So Islam says no to the whole thing, to the whole enterprise, right? And the hadith mentions, the brother mentioned in the beginning, the Prophet ﷺ mentions that time will come where it will be almost impossible to avoid dealing with riba. It will be almost impossible to avoid dealing with riba because it touches everything. And that's the time we're living in, right? You want a student loan, you want a car mortgage, a car loan, you want a house loan, you want financing for your new business, credit cards, like every kind of debt that you can imagine exists in our society, and they're all pretty much based on riba, right? And so it's very difficult to navigate, and inshallah we'll spend a few minutes on that as well. But our guiding principle is that we want to avoid riba. Everything we can do to avoid any type of interest-based transaction, and I'm using just interest as a simple term for it, but a riba-based transaction we want to do, whether that's our work, our investments, our borrowing, or whatever it is, okay? The second thing we want to avoid from an Islamic finance perspective is something called gharar. What does that mean? Anybody know? So it means essentially a very speculative investment. So now any investment you make has some level of speculative nature. Like, let's just say you start a business. Well, the business might go up or it might go down, right? You buy and sell whatever you buy and sell, widgets, right? Cars, whatever. They may go up, they may go down. And so there's always some level of risk, okay? But there are certain things that are very speculative, and those would be considered impermissible. What's an extreme example of that? Some cryptos, right? Some altcoins for sure, right? They're not based on anything, and they may just, they're all totally, wholly speculative. I wouldn't use that as a generic thing for all crypto, but some, right? Like the meme coins and things, right? But take something simple like just gambling, right? I mean, in essence, they say a lot of these meme coins are just gambling, right? And there, you might win $1 million or you might get zero, and it's really just pure randomness. So that would not be allowed, right? Every level of investment you make is going to have a component of risk and a component of speculation, but we're going to stay away from those things that are highly speculative. An example in finance is, at least according to many, are things like options and derivatives, right? You guys familiar with options and derivatives? Anybody who knows finance? But things like that, secondary markets and things like that are going to be much more speculative than the basic sort of first level market. So we want to generally try to avoid those kinds of things, okay? Let me pause here, because I know some of this is technical and dense, but I want to just give you a frame. At least you'll learn these terms once, so when you hear them again, they'll resonate with you and you can do more research. Obviously, we're not going to become experts in Islamic finance in 45 minutes, but the idea is you get introduced to these concepts as you get into the workforce, as you are thinking about investments and where you're going to put your money and what kind of jobs you're going to make. You're going to think about these things, right? So any questions so far? Yes. Good. So now, how are you going to figure out if the thing is halal or not, right? Like, how are you going to know? Okay, some things are obvious. Like, we gave the example of like an alcohol company or like a weapons manufacturer, right? Or some, whatever. You're going to know not to do those. But beyond those, the ones that are mixed, those are harder. And then when we look at companies, there's debt to equity ratios that you're supposed to look at to determine if I'm not allowed to deal with riba in my own life, can I put my money in a company whose balance sheet is full of riba-based debt? And then I become an owner in that company. Because what are you doing when you buy stock? You're becoming an owner, albeit a tiny, 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 tiny percent. But at the end of the day, you're an owner in that company. And so the question is, if it's haram for me, can I just invest in whatever companies are doing good on the stock market that are in a seemingly, like, let's take a industry like real estate or pharmaceuticals or things that they're not doing anything haram from an industry perspective, but their whole balance sheet is interest-based debt. Can I buy that company or not? So the scholars are going to say there are certain debt to equity thresholds which are permissible. Again, because we go back to this, it's impossible almost to avoid everything. So now how do you figure this out? You can either go read the balance sheets of the company, which is not really what most people are going to do, or you can run one of these screens, right? So the Islamic screening apps, there's a bunch of them now. You can run the stock or the holding in the screen to see whether they come up as, Sharia compliant or not. And they might give you different answers, right? But at least you're doing your diligence. So I think it's great. There's a number of different apps, right? And then if you look at some of the mutual funds and ETFs, there's a lot more of them today than there were 10 and 15 years ago. They do that work for you. They do the screenings for you. So whenever you have a chance, you want to use one of those tools that are purporting to do Sharia compliance for you. Now, will they be perfect? Might some of them be fraudulent? Are all of the halal mortgages out there actually halal? Right? Is all the halal food you're actually buying really halal? Like, we don't know. But you want to do your diligence to the best of your ability. At least you can say, I screened what I could screen. Ya Allah, I tried to get as much information as I could. I did my best. But if you're like, look, it's 2024, 2025, it's America, this stuff's too hard, I'm just going to do whatever. That's not going to work, right? So we want to do as much as we can in terms of screens. So I think those screens are very important. So avoiding riba and gharar are going to be very important Islamic principles. I have a few more principles, and then I'll talk more about these mechanics of the specific questions you asked about loans and zakat and stuff. So the next one actually is zakat. Okay, so what is zakat? Everybody knows aqimus salat, atu zakat. Zakat's one of our 5 pillars. But what is it actually? What are we supposed to do when it comes to zakat? Help me out. Like, you might not have to pay zakat yet, many of you, right? But what is zakat? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. So, it's an obligation on every Muslim, right? And it's not a tax. I want to emphasize this. It's not a tax, okay? But on your savings, so not on it's 2.5%. It's not 2.5% of all the money you made, okay? But it's essentially on your savings, and there's a lot of zakat calculators you can use on the internet as well, right? That you have to pay if you have more than a threshold for a year. So Islam is redistributive. Remember we talked about this, that Islam is taking money and redistributing it among the poor, fuqara and masakin. There's 8 classes of permissible beneficiaries of zakat, right? Allah says in the Quran. But it's not for whatever you have. There are a lot of things that are excluded. For example, let's say you have $1 million sitting there in the bank for a year. You'd have to pay zakat, 2.5% of that $1 million. But if you take that $1 million and you buy a house for $1 million, how much zakat do you have to pay now? 0, actually, right? And this is not a way of avoiding zakat. It's just to say that Islam is not putting zakat on certain assets, the ones that you use, right? Or if you took that and you bought an investment property, you'd pay zakat on the rental income. So the point is, we want to understand that zakat is an obligation we should never, ever, ever avoid and miss, right? It's a purification of your wealth. So we shouldn't be stingy in paying zakat. We should be like ready to give zakat because it's going to purify our wealth and Allah will give us more. So this is a really important principle, is that we want to, whatever savings we have, once we cross this threshold, there's a threshold for gold and silver because these were the standards at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So there are certain thresholds. Once you have this much gold equivalent, then you become someone who has to pay zakat, right? You have savings of, a few $1,000s, then you will start to pay zakat on that 2.5%. Now the question is, what's it on? It's on going to be on your cash. It's going to be on your stocks, right? And now something like retirement accounts gets trickier because it's yours, but it's not really yours, right? If you have a 401k, can you use it or not? Not really, right? If you're at your employer, you can't even take it out. But then if you leave your employer, you can roll it over and you could take it out with a penalty, right? And is it pre-tax or post-tax? Pre-tax. So now let's say you have $1,000 in a 401k. Is it really $1,000? No, because when it comes out, there's going to be some tax that's due on it. So my point here is that this stuff does get more complicated. There are actually a decent amount of zakat calculators online as well. And so you should utilize them. You'll put in your assets and your liabilities and the various classes of assets because there's different zakat calculations on them. And then they'll give you numbers. And again, if you try a few of them, then you might get slightly different answers. But at least you know that this is a mandate. Now, zakat is something that you actually have to work harder than general sadaqah. Because you can't just give zakat to anyone. It has to be to one of the qualifying 8 categories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran. So this is another principle of Islamic wealth and finance that we need to make sure that we are fulfilling zakat. So we said avoid riba, avoid gharar, make sure to pay zakat, right? These are like very, very important principles. And then I have 2 more that I want to mention, inshallah, then we'll go back to questions, and I'm sure hopefully this created some more questions in your mind as well. Um, the second is, or the next is to always make sure, even when you don't have a lot, that you have a small amount that you give in sadaqah. Sadaqah will protect you and will bring more into your wealth. The Prophet said, your wealth will not decrease. You know, a lot of times we're like, I got to save up. I'm going to do this. I'm trying to buy this car. I'm trying to buy this house. I need to save up. But the reality is, if you give sadaqah, you will find more blessings in your wealth and in your life. And there's this beautiful narration that there was a man that he had like a garden, and it said that, this is in the hadith, that there was a cloud that came and just showered this specific person's garden. And so one of the Sahaba, he went and or one of the people, the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning, that he went and asked him, like, oh, Fulan, like what was going on? Like, why did this special cloud come and rain over your garden? And he said to him, because you asked, I'll tell you. And he said that he had a financial principle, which was that he would take a third of the wealth from the garden and he would reinvest it. So he would take a third and reinvest it. And he would take a third and he would spend it on his family. And he would take a third and he would give it to charity. And then Allah is providing in ways you can't even imagine, like a special cloud coming and just watering his crop and nobody else's. Okay? And this is like an example that is an illustration for us that Allah works in ways that we won't realize. So always remember that the more you give, the more Allah will give back. In this world. In the hereafter, without question. Right? But even in this world. You've never seen a person, and this is important for young people to think about. You've never seen a person who became poor, whether they're Muslim or not, by giving away too much. Like, you've never even heard of it. Like, this guy was rich and he became poor because he donated too much. Like, he might have become poor because he squandered his wealth, he wasted it, he spent it. You know, so many professional athletes, right? You hear about they went bankrupt after a few years because they weren't disciplined in how they spent their money. But it's never happened because of someone who donated too much to charity. So Allah will put more blessings in your life. This is the next principle. And related to that is barakah. I'm going to mention a couple sort of things about barakah. Barakah is this notion of Allah will give you more than you expect. And it has a level of permanence with it. Meaning, like, let's say you have a test. You study for 30 minutes. You know, the guy or girl next to you has to study for like 3 hours. You've got some barakah in your time, in your wealth, in your family, all these things. We're always looking for barakah. So, for example, the Prophet ﷺ says that whoever wants that their wealth be increased, that one of the things that persons should do is have good connections with their family. Now, like, what does that have to do with money? Nothing. But he's saying this is one of the secrets. If you want, and in the last lecture I just heard, you know, one of the brothers said, I always ask my mom for her du'as. Like, secret little things, right? It will actually make a big difference in your life, right? So that's one. The other is just, Allah says, وَإِذْ تَأَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ لَإِنْ شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. If you're grateful, I will increase my bounty. So when we get a paycheck, whatever things we have, always be grateful and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase it, right? These are just kind of the barakah invitations into our wealth. It's not just dollars and cents. If we only look at like dollars and cents balance sheets, right, they might not be where we want to be. Okay, so these are kind of the guiding principles. Let's then go back to some of these questions and see. We have, what time do we finish? At 5? 5:30? Okay, perfect. So there was a question about, you know, opening investment accounts that are Sharia compliant, and then some loans and some zakat and retirement accounts. I can talk about these in more detail here, but I can also answer more questions that have specifics or that things that came up in the lecture that you have that sort of got you thinking in another direction. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. how do we handle companies that were Sharia compliant, but then at some point no longer are? What do we do with those holdings? Good. Anything else? Because I just want to kind of bunch them together into topics if there's other questions. Yes? Okay. Like when is zakat due and such? Fair. Okay, so that's a zakat question. Anything else? All right, so let's take these categories in the few minutes that we have. So investment accounts and Sharia compliant investing. We said that we want to make sure that we're trying to screen and filter as much as we can to the best of our ability to determine whether the investment is acceptable or not. Now, if you work for a company, this may or may not even be possible in the first place. Because those of you that have 401ks from work, oftentimes they don't even give you the option of picking your investments, right? Do anybody work in a company where you don't have, they give you like 5 or 6 options, right? And they're generally index funds. And the best you can do is like an ESG type of like socially responsible type fund. Anybody have that at work? Right? A lot of people have that at work. So that's one problem in the first place, which is to say that your employer doesn't always give you the flexibility to pick your own investments and run your own screens. Now, some companies will, and some companies even allow you to pay a little, and this is something you can check with your HR or whatever, is sometimes like my first law firm, we actually had a way to pay a little bit extra, and it opened up like Schwab's entire portfolio. So they gave us these index funds to pick from, but you could pay and then you could sort of manage into Schwab's general, and then you could buy individual stocks or these Islamic mutual funds or ETFs and stuff. So you should look if that's possible. Now, if it's not possible, the scholars will differ. Some people will say, okay, well, then you just don't invest in your retirement accounts. But that's somewhat problematic as well because the 401ks usually have an employer match, right? So it's like free money they're giving you. And so now we come to this question of some portion of that money is going to be haram. Some portion of that money that's in that account is going to be haram, and you need to do some sort of cleanse. Okay, so you need to be giving more and more sadaqah to try to account for, it's not even really sadaqah, it's just giving away a portion. Now, you can't really figure out what the exact portion is. This math becomes really, really hard. So you want to give as much as you can away. You want to so you always want to be trying. The very important thing here is you want to be trying. Don't not try. Like you can go to HR, you can lobby. Like I've seen companies, people who work at companies, they get the Muslims together in that company. They go to the, HR department or whatever, and they say, look, we're a big enough contingent here, and we want a Sharia compliant option for investing in our 401k, and they've been able to do that. There've actually been lawsuits against local governments, and Muslims have won because the local government wasn't providing a Sharia compliant opportunity. So these are things that we want to try to always think about. At college campuses, there was a big thing for divesting, and right? So similarly, like you want to try whatever place you are to make sure there are halal investment options. Now, specifically on this question of if a company was halal and now no longer is, this is the challenge of investing in individual companies. It's like they might be halal today, and then tomorrow they might not. And like, are you constantly monitoring these things? I would say you're going to try to go back and do the best of your ability, figure out when it was not, and then try to offload those portion of things that are haram. So you're constantly sort of giving away to charity with an intention of saying, oh Allah, I don't know what percentage of this was not permissible, but I want to cleanse my wealth. I want you to be pleased with the money that I have, because if our income is not halal, then everything that we do is not halal. There's a famous hadith where the person goes in front of the Kaaba, is raising his hands, and the Prophet ﷺ says that he's disheveled, he's raising his hands, he's in front of the Kaaba, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to answer his prayers. Because وَمَطْعَمُهُ حَرَامٌ وَمَلْبَسُهُ حَرَامٌ وَغُذِّيَ بِالْحَرَامِ فَأَنَّا يُسْتَجَابُ لَهُ. That his food is haram, his wealth is haram, his clothing is haram, so how would his du'as be answered? It's a really scary hadith, right? Like we want to make sure that our wealth, like we think about food, right? But we don't think about wealth. And so you want to make sure that wealth is halal. So definitely run screens to the best of your ability, right? All of these Islamic screens and apps, and also some of the Sharia compliant ETFs and mutual funds and stuff, they're supposed to be doing that work for you and constantly monitoring. Now, whether they do it or not, I can't comment on. I'm not affiliated with any of them, but I just think that at least you're trying again when you do that. They take a percentage, so hopefully that percentage is to do that work, right? Um, so that's point number one. And then at work, try your best to be able to control where your money is going, right? If your 401k option doesn't allow it, try to lobby for it. And if you can't, then you say, well, Allah, I'm trying, and then you give more and more away. Okay. Zakat. So now we said zakat. Zakat is due annually after 1 year. So one little note here is that these are lunar years. Okay, so if you say January 1st every year, the Islamic year is actually about 10 days shorter. So you're not going to just do January 1st every year. A lot of people do like Ramadan 1 every year. Now, the reality is like it's due annually. And then there's a difference of opinion among scholars and stuff. It's like when it's due and when you actually have to give it away. So in other words, if you run a calculator, like zakat and Ramadan are not actually tied together. Like your year could be Muharram, it could be Safar, it could be any Islamic month every year, right? But let's just say it's Ramadan for the simplicity of calculation. Every Ramadan 1, you've got an Excel spreadsheet or Google Doc or something, and you're tracking, and you know that on this date, this is the value of my assets. And you calculate your 2.5%. It doesn't necessarily matter that you held every dollar for a year. Because if you start thinking about it like that, it's going to be impossible. It's like, did I hold this specific dollar for a year? It's not like gold bars like they had in the old days, right? So as long as you have more than the nisab, and you still have more than the nisab, and it's a year later, right? Then you're going to give on that. Now it becomes due on you, so you need to give it away, and you want to like do it in a reasonable time. Like you don't have to that day give all your money away. Let's say you owe $1,000 in zakat. So over the next few days, weeks, months, whatever, you're going to give that away. Ideally, you do it as quickly as possible because we might die and who knows what would happen, right? But at the end of the day, the goal is that this now becomes due. It's kind of like Hajj, right? So for Hajj, once you have enough money, you have to go for Hajj. And some scholars say you have to go for Hajj that year. Like the moment you get enough money, you got to go for Hajj. And others will say now it's binding on you. You got to like make a plan for going to Hajj, like, you know, figure it out. But zakat we want to do as quickly as possible. Obviously, the more money you have, the more time it might take you to distribute it. If you got to give away $1,000 or $200, you should do it very quickly. But if you have to give away $1 million, then you want to figure out where are the eligible recipients, right? So that's kind of that point about zakat. And then I'll close with this question of loans and riba, if there's nothing else. So again, this is one of these where, you know, what are our options, people are going to say. If you say everything's haram, then how do we live? Like, I got to go to college, and if my parents can't afford it and I don't get a scholarship, what am I supposed to do? I've actually seen people go and like to their community members. Like there was one scholar who was going to medical school, and he actually went like to so many different people, and he's like, look, like I'm going to go to school. I don't want to take a loan. I want you to essentially, you know, give me these. He went one-on-one to like so many people and borrowed money on a personal basis. Faqad Hassan, I was able to pay it off. So you do what you can. I'm not saying that's going to work for everybody. Obviously, you know, you try and do whatever you can avail yourself from. And if a person is involved in riba, they will, in a loan situation, they want to always try the fastest they can to pay it off. If you're in a loan situation, like sometimes, like I have a lot of clients where their financial advisors will tell them, put money into your retirement accounts because you'll save taxes. But they've got so much debt on them. So the CPA is only looking at it from one lens, which is what? Tax minimization, not barakah, not riba, not sharia. So make sure the advisors that you surround yourself with, right, as you get jobs and as you go into the career workforce, they're not just giving you financial advice, but they're giving you advice that is rooted in our tradition. And that's why we need more Muslims in these fields of estate planning and retirement planning and, you know, finance and all of these things to give sound advice to Muslims, because the vast majority of people are confused, right? So so I think that's really important, is really obviously making dua that, oh Allah, wa man yattaqillah yaj'al lahu makhraja. Oh Allah, like I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to get out of this, but you help me. And Allah will do that. Rather than taking a position of, you know what, like this is the world we live in, everybody's doing it, like whatever, right? That's a dangerous approach. So I think we're up at time and at Maghrib. So if you have questions uh, specifically about law school, about Islamic inheritance, things like that, you can feel free to reach out to me. I have it easily. You can easily find me online, just Yasser Ali, attorney, or Yasser Ali Law, and you can reach out through the website. Inshallah, I'm happy to chat with you about these questions. If anybody's interested in the space, if anybody's trying to work in that field, in that discipline, or wants assistance with their own personal estate planning. For those of you that you might be young, might not, have families and stuff, but you want to think about these things or be proactive about thinking about those things, I'm happy to do that. So inshallah, feel free to reach out. Inshallah, jazakumullah khairan. Hope you found it beneficial. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Can we give our thanks to Yasser Ali for that wonderful session? Okay. I'm going to read while Asr, and then you guys are good to go. While us, innal insana lafi hus illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Thank you all.